First, the 9 o'clock news on BBC One with John Humphreys.
The powers end their talks in Geneva. Will they meet again? Baby cotton becomes a ward of court. 2,500 jobs go at Michelin factories. The Archbishop's messenger at the court of the people. And Britain's biggest switch on to beat the freeze. Good evening. The talks in Geneva between the Americans and the Russians ended tonight after a total of almost 15 hours. That's much longer than scheduled. So far, there's still no official word on how the meetings went, or whether any more have been arranged. But the fact that the Soviet Foreign Minister, Andrei Gromyko, and the American Secretary of State, George Shultz, spent so much time together is being interpreted as a hopeful sign. These meetings were billed only as talks about talks, in other words, a meeting to try to set up a new round of arms control negotiations. Both sides are worried by the build-up of nuclear weapons, and the Russians are particularly concerned about President Reagan's Star Wars defense ideas. So, both East and West are attaching great importance to the Geneva meeting. There was a special report on the talks on Soviet television news tonight, with a senior political commentator reporting from Geneva. He said it was too early to talk about the results of the meetings, but the fact that each side had spelled out its position should help in the next rounds of negotiations. Our diplomatic editor, John Simpson, is also in Geneva. And we'll have a report from John Simpson a little later in the programme. Europe's nuclear weapons are likely to be some way down the agenda for any future arms control talks. Both Britain and France have submarines armed with nuclear missiles. But unlike the French, Britain's missiles are supplied by the Americans. And that could present Mrs. Thatcher with a big problem, as our defence correspondent Christopher Wayne explains.
The Clyde submarine base at Faslane. HMS Renown is alongside, preparing for her next patrol. She carries 16 Polaris missiles, each armed with 3 or 4 Cheveline warheads, able to hit targets 70 miles apart. So if the worst ever happened, this one boat could hit the Soviet Union with up to 64 nuclear explosions in 16 clusters. And if all 4 British Polaris submarines were to fire all their missiles, the Russians could be hit by up to 256 explosions. But when Polaris is replaced by the Trident II missile, that theoretical total will rise dramatically. The Trident has twice the range, is far more accurate, and carries twice as many warheads, each able to hit anywhere in Russia. So regardless of how many missiles and warheads are actually carried aboard the new submarines, the Russians will assume the new missiles can hit 512 different targets. It's certain the Russians will insist on counting British missiles in any future arms control agreement. The British argue that our force is so small that there's no question of a cut unless the two superpowers first achieve substantial reductions in their forces. But that's not a strong bargaining position, because we're buying our Tridents from the Americans. So Britain's Trident plan may be about to go into the Geneva melting pot, and that would mean a headache for Mrs. Thatcher. Any change to a £10 billion programme could affect thousands of British jobs in shipbuilding and in construction. And the trouble is that a lot of that money is about to be spent. The first order for a Trident submarine is due to be placed by the Royal Navy later this year.
And now back to those arms control talks in Geneva and a report from our diplomatic editor, John Simpson.
When Mr. Gromyko arrived at the American mission for the afternoon session, there was no reason to think it would last any longer than the scheduled 3.5 hours. But then it had originally been expected that there'd only be one meeting today anyway, the morning one. He and Mr. Shultz went through the usual motions for the sake of the cameraman, as they've done so often in the past couple of days. And Mr. Gromyko, when someone called out a question about the way things were going, gave one of his bantering, slightly weary answers.
I confirm that I am Gromyko. You confirm?
After that, the two men settled down for a meeting which, as it turned out, lasted almost as long as the first day's 2 sessions combined. At one stage in this highly secretive process, it looked as though someone had made arrangements for a triumphant conclusion. But as it got later and the onlookers thinned out, there was still no sign of an outcome. And when the two men did emerge, together with their aides, they were still as secretive as ever, even though Mr. Gromyko did wish everybody goodbye and thank them for the long wait.
Goodbye and best wishes to you.
Have you agreed to meet again?
Hey, please, once more, please, once more.
And so after 5.5 hours of discussion, that seems to be that. There's no word of whether there's been any decision reached. Still, as the delegations headed off to consult their governments on what they should do now, it's possible that there'll still be agreement. All we know is that there'll be an announcement in 2 hours from now.
Baby Cotton, the girl born to a surrogate mother last week, has been made a ward of court. The decision was made by the High Court this afternoon, but it isn't clear who applied for the order. It wasn't Barnet Council. They'd stopped the baby leaving hospital at the weekend and being handed over to the American couple who'd paid for her.
The news that Baby Cotton had been made a ward of court came late this afternoon, about an hour and a half before Barnet's Social Services Committee was due to discuss the case. The High Court move, clearly a surprise to Barnet Council, means that responsibility for the child now passes from the Social Services Department to the High Court. Neither councillors nor local officials were prepared to say who sought the order, nor to comment upon it. Originally, the chairman of the Social Services Committee, Councillor Vic Lyon, was expected to seek endorsement for his action over the weekend in getting a place of safety order for the child. But instead, when the meeting opened tonight, he announced the legal moves and said that the matter was now sub judice and that it could not therefore be discussed by the meeting. Asked by the leader of the Labour opposition whether he could comment at all upon the legal implications, he said that to do so would be a contempt of court. That is very unfortunate, said the opposition leader. Earlier, the new legal moves were announced by the Chief Solicitor for Barnet.
I have just been informed by a firm of solicitors that the child has been made a ward of court, and therefore I'm afraid that we cannot give you any information and we will be unable to make any press release or give any information whatsoever, because to do so would be a contempt of court.
Oxford Health Authority have defended a hospital's decision to stop treating a kidney patient because the quality of his life couldn't be improved. Derek Sage, who lives at a hostel for the homeless, is now being treated at a private hospital. It's being paid for by a charity which says otherwise he'd have been condemned to death. The health authority said today Mr. Sage had been a dirty and difficult patient, but the decision to stop treating him was purely a medical one.
This is the man whose life apparently was not worth saving. Doctors at Churchill Hospital in Oxford stopped the kidney machine treatment he'd been having for nearly 2 years. According to his GP, it was because they felt his quality of life was too low and he was disrupting the kidney unit by his behaviour. He was finally brought to London yesterday for treatment at a private charity hospital.
He was quite confused about what was going on. We had to explain to him that he was going to London. But he was much better than we anticipated after what the doctors were expecting, yes.
Today, the Oxford Health Authority gave their version of why his treatment was stopped. His behaviour was one factor, they said, but it was really for medical reasons.
It was on declining general medical condition and particularly mental function that this decision was taken in the end. And that is based on his severe blood pressure, untreated because he wasn't able to take the pills and prescriptions supplied for him in this respect, and it gradually damaged his brain and is continuing to gradually damage his brain.
Tonight, the director of Simon House, where Mr. Sage lives, accused the hospital of lying. Derek Sage was taking his medicines regularly, he said, and his brain function had not deteriorated. He is considering suing the health authority on Mr. Sage's behalf. The British Kidney Patient Association, which is paying for the private treatment, is furious with the Oxford doctors.
They entered the health service to practice medicine, not to practice selection. Why don't they all get up in arms and say, we refuse to practice medicine under these conditions because we can't? Why don't they?
Once he's back to normal, Derek Sage will come here twice a week for treatment on a kidney machine. The cost of the treatment, some £1,500 a month, will be borne by the British Kidney Patient Association. They're planning to send a bill to the Oxford Regional Health Authority for this amount, who they say should be responsible for keeping Derek alive.
The Michelin Tyre Company are to sack 2,600 of their workers in Britain. 200 of the jobs will go from the Burnley factory and the rest at Stoke-on-Trent, where the workforce will be cut by nearly half. Michelin, a French-owned company, say they're not selling enough tyres.
Today's announcement by the second biggest tyre manufacturer in the world is yet another bitter blow to workers in the shrinking tyre industry.
I just couldn't believe that a company could suddenly announce 2,400 redundancies and transship the jobs to other factories and also to the continent.
So it's not just the number of redundancies, it's the way they were announced.
Exactly, that obviously we do know the tyre market's in decline, but we never believed that we would be treated such a way.
Our job is to build a viable and healthy factory. And this factory, at 3,300 employees, will still be the biggest factory in the UK tyre industry and still a very, very major employer in Stoke-on-Trent.
This is just the latest in a string of factory closures and cutbacks in the industry. Last year, the most famous British name, Dunlop, after running down its operations, announced a deal to sell them to the Japanese company Sumitomo. The declining tyre market is the product of a savage fight between manufacturers to produce better and better tyres which last longer and mean, ironically, that fewer and fewer are needed. Michelin has been one of the toughest companies. Still a private business, fiercely secretive, it stood huge losses, about £800 million in the last 3 years, of which it says about 70 million has been in the UK. Last year it cut 5,000 jobs in France. Now the same treatment is being meted out here.
5,000 people queue for work in Chicago. They were all after a job with the post office, who'd advertised for 150 new staff. The recovery of the American economy has brought a dramatic cut in the number out of work. In Britain, unemployment has increased to 13%, but in America it's fallen to 7%. Princess Margaret is said to be making excellent progress in hospital following her operation on Sunday. Part of a lung was removed for analysis. It proved to be non-malignant. The Princess is expected to leave hospital within the week. She's had no visitors. It's thought doctors want her to take it easy. The former Labour Prime Minister James Callaghan had an operation yesterday to remove his gallbladder. He's said to be comfortable and cheerful. He'll probably remain in hospital for another 10 days. Sir Brian Horrocks, the World War II general who became a television personality, has died at the age of 89. After the war, he became Black Rod in the House of Lords, but he was best known for his television appearances as a vivid storyteller of epic wartime battles. Sir Brian fought in both World Wars and was wounded and decorated for gallantry in each. He served under Montgomery in North Africa and took a leading part in the Normandy landings, despite frequent pain from wounds which nearly cost him his life. White policemen protected Senator Edward Kennedy from black demonstrators today, for the second time on his controversial visit to South Africa. A crowd chanted "Kennedy, go home" as he attended a meeting in the centre of Johannesburg.
The demonstrators belonged to Black Consciousness, founded by the late Steve Biko. They opposed Mr. Kennedy's visit here, claiming he has little real interest in the plight of South Africa's black people. With the entrance to the building blocked, the police soon arrived in force, clearing the way for Senator Kennedy's arrival. American security agents, shaken by the demonstration, quickly ushered him into the building, the police holding back the protesters outside. While the senator continued with his meeting, the police moved in to disperse the demonstrators. For a foreign opponent of this country, to be protected by the South African police from black demonstrators is something of a novelty in political life here. As he emerged from the building, the senator tried to put a brave face on the incident. This was the second substantial protest he's faced so far in South Africa. These demonstrations, plus the suspicion on the part of many that he's using this visit to boost a possible US presidential bid, is turning Edward Kennedy's trip here into something less than the triumphant success he'd perhaps hoped for. Senator Kennedy may well have expected demonstrations from white protesters, but hardly from black organizations. Apart from showing up the division within black ranks, the demonstrations will be a source of satisfaction to the South African government, who can sit back and watch one of their strongest critics being publicly embarrassed by the very people whose cause he's supposed to be supporting.
In Poland, the secret police chief charged with murdering Father Popiełuszko says at the time he thought the orders for the murder came from a government minister. But Captain Piotrowski said in court today he never had any real evidence, and now he thinks the highest official involved might have been his immediate superior, a colonel who's one of the 4 police officers in the dock. It looks as though interest rates will not be going up, at least for the time being. The latest money supply figures turned out unexpectedly good, and the city responded with enthusiasm. Share values surged upwards, and the Financial Times index rose by 15.5 points to close at a record 971.2. The pound went up in London as well to close at 114.8, that's half a cent up. Dealers were confident today, but still uncertain about the future.
Today's Bank of England figures on the money supply were crucial. After the pound's recent battering, they had looked all but certain to trigger a rise in bank interest rates. So city stockbrokers had runners waiting at the bank to bring the news as quickly as possible. Most by traditional means, but some now using CB radios to gain a few valuable minutes on their rivals.
Okay, sterling.
But as it turned out, they had an unexpectedly cheerful message to transmit.
Plus 1.5%. Sterling M3.
Back in their offices, city analysts concluded that after the slight fall in the money supply, a rise in bank base rates has now been postponed, but that may be all. Very high figures for lending by the banks have given them fresh scope for concern.
OK, sell 5 million at an 8 and buy 5 million back on a split. It's over.
So the immediate threat of a rise in the cost of borrowing has receded a little with these figures, but it could still come in the next 2 weeks. That's if worries about the continuing high level of bank lending add to the recent fears about falling oil prices and the pound.
Labour's energy spokesman Stan Orme has said the government shouldn't rely on miners drifting back to work. On a visit to the Corton Wood picket line in Yorkshire, Mr Orme said unless a settlement was negotiated, the strike could last another year. Yorkshire's biggest pit, Kellingley, started production again today in a small way. The coal board hopes to produce 3,000 tonnes there this week. The normal weekly production is 50,000. 166 men are now working there, but 1,800 are still on strike. The rail unions have called a 24-hour strike in London, Midland and Eastern regions for Thursday week. It's because they say staff who've taken action to support the miners' strike have been victimised. For a few minutes this evening, Britain used more electricity in one go than ever before. The peak demand, 45,000 megawatts, was reached at just after 5 o'clock on one of the coldest winter days on record. And the Central Electricity Generating Board managed to meet the demand, even though the miners' strike has now lasted for 10 months.
This is the central control room of the CEGB. It's the nerve centre from which engineers control the supply and distribution of electricity throughout England and Wales. At 5:01 this evening, they faced and met the biggest demand for electricity there has ever been in this country. 45,046 megawatts, just about 5,000 short of the country's theoretical total capacity. They met it by careful balancing of oil-fired, coal and atomic power stations, made more difficult by the effects of the miners' strike and normal shutdowns. Maps on the wall here show the amount of electricity generated in each area and how much it exports or takes in. They demonstrate clearly how the power stations at the heart of England, mostly big coal-fired stations along the Trent served by Nottingham pits, are generating the most power, as well as the big input from oil-fired stations along the Thames. These enable power to be exported to other areas not so well off, particularly the northwest. The events tonight have demonstrated the CEGB's ability to cope with an enormous demand brought about by the extremely cold weather and also by the restarting of industry after the Christmas and New Year holidays. But it's also shown the ineffectiveness so far of the NUM's campaign to eat up coal stocks and prevent power stations having as much coal as they would like. The NUM has even run a campaign in its own newspaper, calling on its members and others to switch on electricity appliances at 6. On the evidence of today, that campaign has so far failed.
And the bitterly cold weather continues. In South Wales and the West Country, many minor roads were blocked when up to 5 inches of snow fell overnight. Lorries broke down when diesel froze in their tanks. In Norfolk, where temperatures of -15 degrees centigrade were recorded, many schools had to close or send pupils home early. And as elsewhere, children made the most of it. On the continent, it's been even worse. In the south of France, the cold presented grave problems for a flock of flamingos. They were frozen into the lake and had to be specially freed. The Archbishop of Canterbury's envoy, Terry Waite, has been addressing one of the Libyan committees which are debating whether the 4 Britons held there should be set free. After seeing officials from the Libyan equivalent of the Foreign Ministry, he was taken to a People's Congress meeting in Tripoli.
Terry Waite received a polite, even warm welcome as he arrived at a Tripoli People's Congress meeting. And his efforts to improve relations between Britain and Libya were praised. A gathering of students and shopkeepers, teachers and workmen then started in on a hefty session of rhetoric. There was criticism, philosophy, a certain amount of what could be called Britain bashing, and a good deal of personal complaint. One woman recounted how her son had been arrested at Heathrow Airport last April when she was leaving Britain after medical treatment. She hadn't heard from him since. Asked to address the Congress, Terry Waite began with a greeting in Arabic, then stressed the nature of his role.
Politics are made by men. السياسة يصنعها الرجال. Mercy, compassion, and justice come from God.
He described the religious nature of his meeting with Colonel Gaddafi on Christmas Day, then explained one of the things the Church of England could do to help improve relations between the two countries.
I have said to your leader that the Church must take a responsibility for all Libyan people in the British Isles.
He was listened to intently, the style of his address going down well. His only problem arose when a large part of the audience was faced with the dilemma of attending daily evening prayers or hearing out his speech. Diplomatically, he concluded, to applause.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to me today.
Then he went specifically to talk to Khadija Belgasem, the woman who'd complained about her son's arrest. This kind of gesture, shown live on Libyan television, helps his cause.
An Iraqi doctor has been found bound, gagged and suffering from stab wounds by the M4 near Reading. Dr. Inad Hamoudi, who was spotted by passing motorists, had surgery for more than 20 stab wounds. He was a cardiology research assistant for Bristol University, where he'd been studying for 2 years. Dr. Hamoudi was actively involved in politics and wrote to his local newspaper to complain about coverage of the Tehran hijacking. The police can't say whether this was a motive for the attack, and they've been searching his hostel in Bristol for more clues. Patrick Harrington, the National Front activist, returned to North London Polytechnic today for the first time this term. Students who object to him studying for a philosophy degree demonstrated as he went up to the library. On Thursday, the students will consider a proposal that Mr. Harrington study in a separate Polytechnic annex. The ice and snow has meant most of tonight's football was postponed, so only 2 FA Cup third-round replays survived, and the scores there: Darlington 2, Middlesbrough 0, that's the latest score, and Grimsby 4, Notts County 2. Grimsby now take on Watford in the next round. And the main news points again. Mr. Schulz and Mr. Gromyko have ended their talks in Geneva, but there's no word yet of any agreement. The baby born to a surrogate mother last week has been made a ward of court, and 2,500 jobs have been cut at Michelin tyre factories. And finally, the photographers turned out in force in London's Leicester Square today. So many of them, they stopped the traffic for a while, and most had great difficulty even getting to see the man they were trying to photograph. But no doubt he was used to it. He was Charlton Heston, who's here for his first appearance on the British stage. He didn't seem bothered by all the fuss. As he said, it's a living. I could be out clipping hedges. News nights on BBC 2 at 20 to 11. From us, for now, good night.